The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, casting the nurse's station in that particular shade of white that made everyone look like they'd been dead for 3 days. Ashley Cooper refolded the same stack of gauze for the 3rd time, her hands moving with the kind of precision that made the motion meditative, muscle memory running on autopilot while her eyes tracked the hallway. Folding. Restocking. Existing without being seen. This was the art she perfected over 18 months at St. Michael's Virginia Hospital in Raleigh, the art of taking up as little space as possible. The scrubs hung loose on her frame, faded from something approaching blue into the color of old denim left in the sun. Size medium, though she could have worn small. The deliberate formlessness was calculated. Under the left sleeve, sewn into the jacket lining where no one would notice unless they were looking, was a unit patch from Special Forces Medical Command. Not that anyone looked. Not that anyone asked questions about the thin scar that ran from her collarbone to her shoulder, visible when she stretched for supplies on the top shelf. She wore her hair in a regulation bun, not military regulation, her regulation. Tight enough that it pulled the skin of her temples taut, kept everything controlled, kept everything in place. Her boots were the kind with good arch support and barely scuffed leather, the kind nurses wore when they were serious about their job. The kind that didn't make noise on linoleum when you walked. The VA hospital smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, the kind that had been sitting in the break room pot since 5 a.m. Underneath that, if you got close enough, was the smell of wound dressing changes and the faint copper undertone of blood, though that might have been her imagination. Might have been memory. Might have been the same thing. Room 304 was at the end of the eastern corridor, past the medication station and around the corner where the afternoon light came through at an angle that made the tile shine like dark water. Ashley had walked this route 43 times during her shift, and she knew without counting how many steps it took to get there from the supply closet. 38. She knew the exact location of every squeaking tile, every spot where the floor had lifted just barely enough to be a trip hazard for someone not paying attention. She paid attention. James Garrett lay in room 304 with the kind of stillness that came from military training or resigned acceptance. Probably both. He was a Special Forces veteran, the kind of soldier whose chart read like a casualty report: shrapnel wound to the larynx in Tikrit 6 years ago, no ability to phonate, tracheostomy status post, 6 months of physical therapy that had taught him how to breathe but not how to speak. He communicated through eye contact and hand signals, the old language of men in dark places where words got people killed. Ashley entered his room at 2:08 p.m., her badge clipped to her scrub pocket angled inward so it wouldn't catch the light. The sunlight through the window hit James's face at an angle that made his scar tissue visible, the puckered skin around the tracheostomy site, the way his throat didn't move the way throats were supposed to move. He'd lost more than his voice to that shrapnel. He'd lost the ability to call for help, to negotiate, to scream. "Vitals check," she said quietly, pulling the blood pressure cuff from its Velcro strap on the wall. Her voice came out about 2 octaves lower than most people expected from someone who looked like this, small, deferent, the kind of nurse who moved through hallways like she was afraid of displacing too much air. James's eyes tracked her movements. Not the clinical assessment of a patient watching a healthcare provider. The tactical assessment of someone evaluating distance, speed, threat level, asset status. His pupils were steady, tracking. His gaze was the kind that had muscle memory behind it, that had been trained to notice things other people missed. She wrapped the cuff around his arm. Blood pressure 118/76. Sinus rhythm, steady. Respiration 16, unlabored. She wrote the numbers down in his chart with a pen that had lost most of its blue color through use, the ballpoint moving across the page in the exact same handwriting she'd maintained for 19 years, the kind of handwriting that could have been anyone's, that raised no flags, that belonged to a woman who understood the value of being unremarkable. "Heart sounds clear," she said, listening with a stethoscope she kept clipped to her pocket. "No acute distress." That was when James grabbed her wrist. His grip wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. The grip of someone who knew what they were doing, whose hands had muscle memory all their own. His eyes locked onto hers, and she felt the room compress, felt the space between them become something smaller than physical distance. He tapped his chest twice with his free hand. Tap. Tap. Not a heartbeat. A pattern. A signal. Then he pointed at her. The gesture hung in the air between them like a question, or an accusation, or a recognition that predated both of those things. His eyes had changed. The assessment had become something else, something that carried weight and knowledge and the kind of understanding that came from having survived things that weren't supposed to survive. Ashley's composure didn't slip. Not a single muscle in her face moved. Not her jaw, not her eyes, not the small muscles around her mouth that might have indicated surprise or concern or any of the things a normal person would feel when a patient who hadn't communicated verbally in 6 years suddenly grabbed their wrist and made a deliberate gesture that meant something she understood but couldn't possibly acknowledge. She waited. This was her strength, the ability to wait. To let other people fill the silence. To let the weight of unsaid things accumulate until they became unbearable for everyone except her. James released her wrist. He leaned back against his pillow. He picked up his notepad, the whiteboard and dry erase marker system that passed for communication with patients who'd lost the infrastructure for speech, and wrote nothing. Just held the marker, watching her. "I'll check your dressing before I leave the ward," Ashley said. Her voice remained level, unremarkable. A nurse delivering standard care to a standard patient. "You need anything, use the call button." She turned toward the door, her movements economical, no wasted motion. Behind her, she heard the soft scratch of the whiteboard marker against the plastic, but she didn't turn around. Didn't look back. The protocol was simple: see nothing, report nothing, exist in a way that made everyone around you forget you'd ever been there. The hallway stretched before her, white and institutional and full of the ambient sounds of a hospital in the middle of shift change. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in a room 3 doors down. Someone's for-pump beeped a discordant rhythm that hadn't been silenced yet. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang and kept ringing. And then, cutting through all of it, came the voice from the direction of the nurse's station. "Nurse Cooper." Not a request. The tone had the weight of institutional authority behind it, the kind that made the back of her neck tense in a way she wouldn't let show. "I need to review your supply logs for the Eastern Corridor." Dr. Marcus Pierce stood at the nurse's station like he'd been waiting for her specifically. His white coat was pristine, actually pristine, not the worn-in kind that came from wearing the same coat for 12 hours straight. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a decoration, the earpieces never inserted into his ears. His watch was expensive, the kind that announced itself, the kind that existed to be noticed. Behind him, the medication cabinet locker sat with the supply sheets clipped to its front. The sheets that Ashley maintained with a kind of obsessive precision that would have seemed paranoid if it came from anyone other than someone trying desperately not to give anyone a reason to look at her too closely. She approached the station. Her badge felt heavy against her chest, the weight of it sudden and unwelcome. "The logs are current, Dr. Pierce," she said. He was already pulling them down, already running his eyes across the numbers with the kind of scrutiny that suggested he was looking for something specific. Not errors. Something that could become errors, if he applied the right amount of pressure and documentation. But that wasn't the worst part. What Ashley didn't know yet, as she stood at the nurse's station watching Dr. Marcus Pierce review her supply counts with the careful attention of a man building a case, was that he'd spent the last 6 months constructing something much more elaborate than simple accusation. He'd been watching, waiting, documenting every small thing that could be twisted, every deviation from protocol that could be weaponized. And he'd been doing it for a reason that had nothing to do with supply counts. She didn't know that yet. She would find out in 72 hours. During Thursday grand rounds, Dr. Marcus Pierce stopped mid-lecture, his voice cutting through the sterile air like a scalpel. The residents clustered around him, 20 of them, fresh-faced and hungry to impress, waited for the next pearl of wisdom from the chief of staff. He gestured toward the crash cart where Ashley restocked supplies with practiced efficiency, her movements invisible in the way that years of invisibility teaches you to move. "Come here, Cooper." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song as she approached. The residents' eyes tracked her like predators sensing movement. She knew what was coming. She could read it in the angle of Pierce's jaw, the way his fingers drummed against the patient chart in his hand. This was calculated. This was the opening move of something larger. He held up the chart. Mr. Garrett's medication reconciliation form. The room went dead silent. You filed it in the wrong section. Wrong tab. Wrong sequence. His voice dropped, became almost conversational, the tone that was somehow worse than shouting. Do you understand the liability you've created? What happens if a resident pulls this chart and misses a critical drug interaction because you couldn't follow a 3-step filing protocol? Ashley stood motionless. Her jaw tightened. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. Where did you get your nursing degree, Cooper? Or did you just pick one up at a discount? A few residents shifted their weight. One, a young woman in her 3rd year, looked at her shoes. The proximity to medicine doesn't make you a doctor, Pierce continued, his words designed to land like blows. It just means you're closer to the mistakes you'll make. He turned to the residents, his smile thin and predatory. This is what happens when nurses develop delusions of competence. This is the liability we're trying to prevent. Understood? Yes, sir, they chorused. Ashley turned and walked back to the crash cart. Her hands resumed their work, gauze, syringes, defibrillator pads, each item placed with military precision. Perfect. Mechanical. Untouched by what had just happened in front of 20 witnesses. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, during the shift change at 3:16 p.m., Pierce found her by the vending machines in the hallway outside the break room. 3 nurses stood nearby, pretending to search for quarters, pretending not to watch. The hallway smelled of stale coffee and the chemical bite of hand sanitizer. You're incompetent, Cooper. His voice was low now. Intimate. Worse. I've documented 12 procedural errors this month. 12. The misfiled form. Incomplete vitals on post-op patients. Medication reconciliation errors on the trauma floor. How you still have credentials is beyond me. You're a liability to this hospital. His finger rose, pointed near her face. Not touching. Never touching. That was how he operated, the appearance of professionalism while the blade went in sideways. Ashley's hands hung at her sides. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. Her face became what it had been in the desert, what it had been in the field hospitals of Tikrit, an expressionless mask. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her eyes locked onto his with the flat, colorless intensity of winter steel. He waited for her to crack. To defend herself. To give him something. She gave him nothing. When he finally paused for breath, that necessary moment where he had to inhale, she spoke. Her voice came out measured and quiet, the words landing with the weight of precision ordnance. My patients deserve better than a supervisor who spends more time on performance reviews than patient care. She turned on her heel with military precision and walked away. Each step was controlled. Each footfall deliberate. She didn't hurry. She didn't look back. Behind her, Pierce's face flushed purple. His hands clenched into fists. She heard him call after her, "This conversation isn't finished, Cooper," but his voice had lost its edge. It sounded almost desperate. The other nurses stared at him, then at her retreating back. That night, alone in the supply closet with the door shut and the shelves of sterile packages surrounding her like walls, Ashley's hand shook. Just for a moment. Just until the door closed. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the earthquake that happens when you don't move for 40 years and suddenly remember what motion feels like. She pressed her palm against the inner jacket lining, feeling the shape of the faded unit patch sewn there, the only thing she still carried from the woman she used to be. The only anchor to Captain Ashley Cooper of the 5th Special Forces Group, the woman who didn't exist anymore except in the fibers of her own tissue memory. The third incident came at 4:23 p.m. the following evening. She was in the medication room, restocking the automated dispensary, when she noticed the discrepancy, a controlled substance log showing withdrawal quantities that didn't match the patient charts. Fentanyl. Morphine. Small amounts, but consistent. The kind of pattern that takes training to spot. She was photographing the log with her phone when she felt the presence behind her. The air pressure changed. She didn't need to turn around to know that Pierce stood in the doorway with 2 security officers flanking him like bookends. That's restricted access, Cooper. Step away from the system. She stepped away. She placed the phone in her pocket with the same measured movements. The security officers escorted her from the medication room. Pierce's hand never left his phone. He was photographing her, documenting her, building his case with the precision of a surgeon building a wound that would never quite heal. His voice followed her down the hallway. We'll be discussing this incident. My office. Tomorrow. 0900 hours. She kept walking. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. At the nurse's station, the charge nurse pretended she wasn't looking. The resident who'd been kind to her during grand rounds suddenly became very interested in a computer screen. That night, Ashley sat in her apartment, a small 2-bedroom in Raleigh that she paid for in cash and kept empty of anything that might suggest a life, and cross-referenced the patient files she'd documented that morning. The pattern was clear. Mute patients. Cognitively impaired patients. James Garrett, who couldn't report being billed for procedures he'd never received. 5 others. All charged for services never rendered. All vulnerable. All defenseless. She brought her findings to the hospital compliance officer at 8:15 a.m., a man named Rodriguez who worked in the basement office that smelled like photocopier toner. I think there's a billing irregularity we should investigate, she said, sliding the documentation across his desk. Rodriguez glanced at the papers. His face went careful. Professional. The kind of careful that meant he understood what he was looking at but wasn't sure what to do with it. I'll look into it, he said. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Within an hour, Pierce's assistant was calling. Dr. Pierce needs to see you. Now. His office was on the 4th floor, all mahogany and diplomas and the kind of expensive furniture that announced success. Pierce sat behind his desk like a judge behind a bench. His voice was pleasant. Almost friendly. That was the most dangerous version. I understand you've been accessing patient files outside your assigned care areas, he said. Ashley said nothing. That's a HIPAA violation. A serious one. He slid a pre-printed counseling form across the desk. This documents your unauthorized access to restricted records. It's already been filed with HR. I recommend you get familiar with the hospital's disciplinary procedures. She looked at the form. It was dated 3 days earlier. 3 days before she'd accessed anything. He'd anticipated her. Prepared for her. Known what she would do before she did it. You're dismissed, Pierce said, turning to his computer as if she'd already left. That evening, when Ashley returned to her locker, she found her badge access card. It had been deactivated. The records room, the administrative offices, the medication dispensary, all locked to her now. She tried her employee ID at the controlled substance room and the system rejected her with a red light and a soft beeping sound like her electronic heartbeat failing. In her locker, folded neatly on her uniform, was a printed email. No signature. No identifying information. Just 4 lines. Ashley held the paper for exactly 4 seconds. Then she burned it in the sink of the hospital bathroom, watching the edges curl black, watching the words become ash, watching the smoke disperse into the ventilation system where it would never be found. Outside the bathroom window, the Raleigh rain began to fall. It hammered the glass like applause or accusations, impossible to distinguish between the two. The rain against the bathroom window stopped at 6:33 a.m. Ashley had counted the seconds, a habit from 17 years of timing tourniquets and hemorrhage control. Muscle memory applied itself to everything, breathing, waiting, the precise calculation of how long a person could hold their composure before it cracked like old bone china. She'd learned in Tikrit that composure wasn't the absence of fear. It was fear metabolized into something useful. Into action. She dressed in fresh scrubs. The fabric still smelled like the hospital laundry, bleach and industrial heat. She pinned her badge to her chest, the hospital ID photograph showing a woman who looked 15 years older than she felt. The woman in the photo had never been to Tikrit. Had never held a bleeding artery closed with her bare hands while rounds snapped overhead like angry hornets. That woman had started the job as Captain Ashley Cooper and ended it as someone else entirely. Someone who folded gauze and restocked supplies and kept her head down. The hallway outside room 304 hummed with the particular chaos of morning rounds. Residents moved in loose clusters, attending physicians barking orders, nurses navigating the current like fish in a stream they'd learned to read before most people learned to drive. Ashley moved through it with practiced invisibility. She'd gotten good at that. 15 months at St. Michael's without anyone asking her real name, without anyone asking why her hands moved with such terrible precision during difficult procedures, why her voice carried weight that didn't match her job title. She was just the quiet nurse. The one who never complained. The one who cleaned up messes. James Garrett's room was on the north wing, 4th floor. She could see it from the supply station, the blue-gray light of monitors casting shadows on beige walls. She'd been checking on him 3 times per shift since the day he'd gripped her wrist and tapped his chest twice. The gesture had meant something in a language that hadn't been spoken in this hospital in 20 years. I recognize you, sister. Not your face. Your soul. The ones who've seen what you've seen carry a signature they can't hide from people who've also worn the call sign. She was hanging fresh for bags in the medication room when the first alert came through the monitor system. A soft electronic beep from James's bedside equipment. Not alarming yet. Just informational. Just a change. Ashley's head lifted before the beep had finished sounding. Her hand stilled on the saline bottle. Some people notice changes in vital signs the way most people noticed weather. She noticed them the way apex predators noticed the scent of blood on the wind, automatic, primitive, impossible to ignore. She moved to the monitoring station. The screen showed room 304 cycling through readings in real time. Heart rate elevated. 112 beats per minute. That was stage 1. Compensation. The body trying to move blood that something was preventing from flowing freely. Blood pressure 136/88. Still acceptable ranges. Still normal enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. But there was a rhythm underneath those numbers, a pattern that screamed if you knew how to listen. The diastolic pressure was climbing. The pulse pressure was narrowing. The shape of the waveform had changed. She was already moving before her conscious mind caught up to what her combat training had already diagnosed. Pericardial effusion. Fluid accumulating around the heart. James's heart was drowning inside its own protective sac. The attending physician on morning rounds was Dr. Reeves, a cardiology specialist who rotated through the VA every 6 weeks. He was reviewing a chart at the nursing station, glasses perched on his nose, the kind of physician who actually listened when nurses spoke. Ashley approached with her voice level, her body language deferential. She'd learned that authority figures responded better when you made them feel they were still in charge of the conversation. Dr. Reeves, I'm seeing changes in room 304. Elevated heart rate, diastolic pressure climbing, and his JVD appears more distended than this morning. Reeves looked up. He was the type who would ask follow-up questions. Would want specifics. Would not dismiss a concern simply because it came from a nurse with a blank expression and carefully neutral hands. Current vitals, he asked, already standing. Heart rate 112. BP 136/88. O2 sat 97 on room air. She paused. But the waveform changes suggest fluid accumulation. Reeves moved toward the room immediately. Ashley followed. Through the doorway, she could see James propped at a 45-degree angle, his neck veins distended like tree roots pushing through soil. Muffled heart sounds when Reeves placed the stethoscope. No clear S1 and S2 separation. Just a distant whooshing, as if the heart were performing underwater. "We need cardiothoracic surgery," Reeves said. "This is Beck's triad." Muffled heart sounds, elevated JVD, hypertension trend. Acute pericardial effusion with tamponade physiology. He moved back to the nursing station and began making calls. St. Michael's had a cardiothoracic team, but they were in an active surgery. The on-call surgeon was in traffic on IU-40, incoming from Chapel Hill. ETA 40 minutes. Maybe 35 if traffic cooperated. Maybe 50 if it didn't. Ashley knew the mathematics of that calculation. James's blood pressure was already dropping. His heart rate compensating, working harder to pump blood through fluid that was pressing down from all sides like hands closing around a throat. In 40 minutes, the compensation would fail. In 40 minutes, his blood pressure would crater. In 40 minutes, he would arrest. Reeves turned to the charge nurse. "Get me 2 large bore 4s, fluid bolus standing by. And page cardiothoracic again. Tell them this is critical." The charge nurse nodded and began moving. The room suddenly had urgency, had purpose, had the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing someone was actively dying. Ashley prepared the equipment, the crash cart positioned near the bed, defibrillator pads opened, medications drawn and labeled. She'd done this 100 times in a previous life. 1,000 times. Her hands moved like they were choreographed to a music only she could hear. That was when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. He had a way of materializing in spaces where he wasn't wanted, like a stain spreading through clean fabric. His eyes moved across the scene, the equipment, the elevated anxiety, Dr. Reeves making urgent phone calls, and something shifted in his face. Not concern. Recognition. The look of someone who'd just realized there was a mistake being made that he could exploit. "What's happening here?" he said. Not a question. A challenge. Dr. Reeves answered without looking up from the phone. "Acute pericardial effusion. Cardiothoracic is en route." "How long?" Pierce asked. 40 minutes. Maybe 35. Pierce nodded slowly. Then he turned to Ashley. His voice came out smooth as water, smooth as poison poured into clear liquid. "Nurse Cooper, I need you to return to your assigned floor. Now." Ashley didn't look at him. She was checking the fall line, confirming flow rate, confirming that James had adequate access. Dr. Reeves requested assistance with. "I'm aware of what's happening in this room, and I'm also aware that you have an assignment. The second floor is understaffed. You're going to report to your charge nurse immediately." Dr. Reeves turned from the phone call. "Actually, I can use her. She's observant, Anne." "Dr. Reeves," Pierce interrupted, his voice taking on that particular texture that senior physicians used when they wanted to remind junior physicians of the hierarchy, "I think we should let Mr. Garrett rest. The excess stimulation in the room is not helping his condition. Let's clear out, let the monitoring system do its job, and trust that cardiothoracic will arrive when they arrive." It was wrong. Every cell in Ashley's body screamed that it was wrong. The heart monitor showed her what Pierce's words were designed to obscure: a patient in active decompensation, a window of opportunity that was closing with each passing minute. But she also knew exactly what was happening. Pierce wasn't making a clinical decision. He was making a move on a chessboard where she was the piece he wanted off the board. "With respect, sir," Reeves said, "Beck's triad is." "I'm aware of Beck's triad, Dr. Reeves. I'm also aware that you've been here 6 weeks and I've been managing this facility for 9 years. We monitor conservatively. We wait for the cardiothoracic team. We don't escalate because one patient is having an anxiety response." Ashley watched James's face. Saw the way his fingers gripped the bed rail. Saw the understanding in his eyes. He knew. He could read vital signs in the beeping of machines the way some people read novels. He could see his own death approaching like a train down an empty track. Pierce placed a hand on Dr. Reeves's shoulder, the gesture intimate, collegial, designed to establish alliance. "Mr. Garrett is stable," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "There's no indication of tamponade physiology at this time. Nurse Cooper has a pattern of escalating every situation beyond medical necessity. It's something we're addressing through the proper channels. For now, I need this room cleared and Mr. Garrett allowed to rest." He turned to Ashley directly. His eyes held the cold precision of someone who'd perfected the art of destruction through the simple mechanism of being plausible. "Return to your assignment, Nurse Cooper. If you don't comply, I'll have security escort you out. Your choice." The hallway outside room 304 was suddenly the entire world. Ashley could hear the heart monitor beeping, could see James's oxygen saturation beginning to drift downward on the monitor, could feel the weight of the decision that was being forced into her hands. Comply, and she stayed employed. Comply, and she watched someone die. Comply, and she became complicit in the specific machinery of institutional violence that let killers hide behind policy. Or she could choose the other option. She moved out of the room without speaking, without acknowledging Pierce's victory. She walked back to the nursing station while her mind calculated distances, timing, the precise moment when shift change would create the specific chaos that made surveillance imperfect. When the hallway would be full enough that a locked door could open and close without witnesses remembering exactly when it happened. She checked the clock, 8:34 a.m. Cardiothoracic ETA was 9:14. Unless traffic was worse than predicted. Unless the on-call surgeon got delayed at the previous hospital. Unless the mathematics that governed human bodies operated on a different schedule than the mathematics that governed human traffic. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Ashley Cooper had spent 15 months invisible at St. Michael's Virginia Hospital, had maintained the perfect fiction of being someone unremarkable, had buried the woman who'd once worn captain's bars and combat boots so deep that even she'd almost believed the nurse was all that was left. And now, standing in the break room watching the clock advance one agonizing second at a time, she understood that all of that had been prologue. All of that had been preparation. All of that had been leading to a single moment when she would have to choose between the identity she'd been given and the identity she'd earned in a country where her government had officially never stationed her. James's blood pressure dropped to 128/82 at 8:41 a.m. It dropped to 124/78 at 8:02 a.m. At 8:51 a.m., his oxygen saturation began to fall. 97%. 95%. 92%. Ashley stood at the medication station, hands moving on their own, pulling equipment and medications, knowing exactly what she would do and exactly what it would cost. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent song. The hospital moved around her in its unconscious rhythm. Somewhere down the hallway, Dr. Pierce was probably documenting something. Probably building his case. Probably believing he'd won. He had no idea what was about to walk through the doors of room 304. He had no idea who he was actually standing next to. At 8:57 a.m., Ashley moved through the hallway during shift change. At 8:58 a.m., she unlocked room 304. At 8:59 a.m., she began preparing the emergency equipment because James Garrett was no longer her patient assignment. He was her responsibility. He was her brother in arms. He was the reason she'd learned to keep her composure in the first place, to survive long enough to matter, to hide long enough to be useful, to wait long enough that when the moment came, her hands would be steady enough to save a life that everyone else had already written off as dying. She pulled a scalpel from the crash cart. Ran her thumb across the blade, testing, confirming, remembering. The metal was cool against her skin. Professional. Honest. Behind her, James's heart monitor accelerated to 118 beats per minute. Then 125. Then 132. His blood pressure fell below 90 systolic. The on-call cardiothoracic surgeon was still 8 minutes away. Ashley locked the door. The monitor flatlined at 2:36 p.m. James Garrett's chest stopped moving. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm one moment, then nothing, just the single long tone of a dead line cutting through the afternoon. Ashley was 3 floors away, restocking for lines on the pediatric ward, when the overhead speaker crackled, "Code Blue, room 304. Code Blue, room 304. She didn't run. Running would draw attention. She walked fast, her shoes clicking against the tile with the precision of someone who'd moved through hostile territory without announcing herself. The stairwell was empty. 2 flights down. Her badge still worked. Pierce hadn't revoked it yet, though she could feel the machinery grinding. The door to the 4th floor opened into controlled chaos, 2 nurses scrambling, the code cart already positioned, someone bagging with a mask valve unit while another staffer performed compressions on James's chest. "Who's on call?" Ashley asked, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Dr. Reeves. He's in surgery." "Cardiothoracic is," the resident paused, checking his phone, still 18 minutes out. "Maybe 20. The on-call surgeon got held up at Mercy General with a dissecting aorta." 18 minutes. "Maybe 20. Ashley looked at James's face. His eyes were closed. His skin had already begun to grey. The compressions were keeping his brain alive, but barely. His EKG showed something she recognized from 1,000 crisis moments in fieldwork: fine ventricular fibrillation. The kind of rhythm that meant his heart wasn't beating. It was quivering. And they could shock it all day and get nothing but an empty room and a death certificate. She'd seen this before. In Tikrit. In a field hospital with no surgeons and 2 men coded out on stretchers while artillery walked fire toward the compound. In one of those moments, she'd opened a chest with a combat knife and found a pericardial tamponade, fluid compressing the heart like a tourniquet around a limb. She drained it with a 14-gauge needle. The man had walked out 3 weeks later. James needed the same thing. His heart wasn't beating because something was compressing it. She could feel it in the way the compressions weren't generating output, the way his pupils weren't responsive, the way the monitor showed a rhythm without perfusion, electrical activity without a heartbeat. Pericardial effusion, just like Dr. Reeves had said. Just like Dr. Pierce had overruled. "Get me a crash cart," Ashley said. "We have one. It's the crash cart. The full one. And get me the surgical kit from supply. Now." A nurse she didn't recognize hesitated. Ashley's voice dropped an octave. "Did I stutter?" The nurse moved. Ashley turned to the resident. "Stop compressions for 10 seconds. I need to listen." "For what?" "We need to keep." 10 seconds. The compression stopped. The room held its breath. Ashley pressed the stethoscope to James's chest. Muffled. Like listening to someone speak through a pillow. Heart sounds obscured. Lungs hyperinflated. Everything compressed. She'd performed this procedure in the dark, in rain, in a sandstorm with visibility at 2 meters and rounds incoming. She'd done it with a Ka-bar knife and a bedpan as a retractor. She could do it in a sterile operating room on a full-code patient in a VA hospital at 2:16 in the afternoon. The surgical kit arrived. Ashley opened it with 2 hands, sterile field, careful and deliberate. She'd performed this procedure in the dark, but not in 6 years. Not since she'd traded her rank and her name for a badge that said RN and scrubs that made her invisible. Muscle memory didn't care about the time gap. She found the scalpel. The blade gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a promise. She marked the incision site, left anterolateral thoracotomy, between the 4th and 5th ribs, the access point she could find in her sleep. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for another attending. She prepped the skin with betadine and felt for the landmarks beneath the pale flesh, the curve of the ribs, the intercostal space where her fingers had found 1,000 times before. "What are you doing?" the resident asked. Ashley made the incision. Blood welled immediately, dark red, the arterial kind, which meant she'd hit something. She controlled it with her thumb, found the bleeding point, and kept moving. The ribs spread under her hands as she positioned the retractor, a rib spreader that opened his chest cavity like a book she was reading for the first time and the 10,000th time simultaneously. "Stop," the resident said. "You can't." The pericardial sac came into view, distended like a water balloon filled too full. Straw-colored fluid. The exact thing that Dr. Reeves had diagnosed. The exact thing that Dr. Pierce had dismissed. Ashley took the scalpel to the pericardium and made a small incision, controlled and precise. Fluid poured into the chest cavity, dark gold, infected-looking, the kind of drainage that meant James's heart had been drowning in its own membrane. Immediately, his pressure stabilized. The monitor's tone changed, 1 beep, 2 beeps, then a steady rhythm beginning to emerge. She reached into his chest and felt his heart. It was barely moving. A flutter. A tremor. Nothing. She began cardiac massage, her hands cradling the ventricles, compressing with a rhythm she'd learned from a special forces surgeon in a tent that no longer existed. Pump. Release. Pump. Release. The heart was cold and still, but it had muscle memory too. "Come on, James," she whispered. "Come on." The heart stuttered. Missed. Tried again. 1 beat. 2. A rhythm establishing itself like sunrise after a 12-hour night. The monitor picked it up, beep, 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 sinus rhythm, slow but present, weak but alive. Ashley kept her hand on his heart for one more moment, feeling it strengthen under her palm, then withdrew and began closing the pericardium with sutures that her hands knew how to place even if her brain hadn't used them in 6 years. Her movements were economical. Necessary. Nothing wasted. The kind of closure you perform when you're running out of time or running out of light or running out of luck. She'd closed James's chest cavity and was placing the final sutures when the door behind her unlocked with a master key. The sound, a click like a safety lever being released, was the moment everything changed. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway. His face hadn't purpled like it had at the vending machines. This was worse. This was bureaucratic fury, the cold rage of a man watching his institutional control slip through his fingers like sand through a fist. "What have you done?" His voice was soft. That was the dangerous part. Not loud. Whispered. The voice of someone who knew he had leverage and knew he would use it. Ashley didn't look up from James's chest. She tied the final suture and cut it with the scissors, her movement steady as surgical steel. Only then did she turn to face him. "My job," she said. Dr. Pierce's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone and began documenting photos of the open chest, the sutures, the surgical field. "This is a violation of hospital policy for .7.2, subsection B, a scope of practice. Unauthorized surgical intervention. You're a nurse, not a physician. Not even close." He was talking into his phone now, voice recorder active. Patient code called at 1438. Unauthorized personnel performed emergency thoracotomy without surgical authority. Patient was resuscitated but intervention exceeded nursing scope. He looked at Ashley with eyes like chips of ice. "You're finished here." By 3:15 p.m., the formal complaint had been filed. By 3:30, hospital security had received the order. By 4 o'clock, they deactivated her badge while she was still in the locker room, still in her scrubs, still smelling like James's blood and betadine. Dr. Pierce escorted her personally to her locker. He stood with his arms crossed, watching as she pulled out her personal items, a half-empty coffee cup from 3 weeks ago, a photo of her son, a faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one thing she'd kept from a life that officially didn't exist. The patch was from the 75th Ranger Regiment, a unit before she'd been transferred to the classified side of the house, before everything had been scrubbed from official record. She tucked it into her jacket pocket. "Your nursing license will be suspended pending a state board investigation," Dr. Pierce said quietly. "My lawyers will have a formal complaint filed by tomorrow morning. You practiced medicine without a license. You endangered a patient. You violated your scope of practice, hospital protocol, and basic institutional hierarchy. He stepped closer. "You'll never work in healthcare again, Ashley. I'll make sure of it." She turned to face him. Her voice dropped an octave, the voice of someone who'd given orders to soldiers and been obeyed. "You overruled a diagnosis that saved his life." Dr. Reeves was correct. The patient was in tamponade. If I hadn't intervened, James Garrett would be dead in the morgue downstairs. She looked at him directly. "I saved his life. That's not a violation. That's a miracle. And you're going to spend the rest of your career explaining why you tried to stop it." Dr. Pierce's face darkened, but Ashley was already moving past him, badge in hand, locker closed. By 5:45 p.m., she was standing alone in the hospital's laundry room in street clothes. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless hospital song. She picked up her scrubs, still damp with James's blood, and folded them with parade ground precision. Corners aligned. Seams matched. The fabric whispered under her hands like a ghost of the uniform she'd once worn, the one with captain's bars and a call sign and a classification level higher than most government buildings. She slid the folded scrubs across the counter to the attendant and walked out without speaking. In the parking lot, the Raleigh evening was settling into blue-grey dusk. Ashley sat in her car in the back row, away from the lights, away from the cameras, her hand steady on the steering wheel even though they'd just held another human being's heart. She could still feel the warmth of it. The faint rhythm of life returning. She pulled out her phone to check on her son, Marcus. 16 years old. Smart kid. Too smart for his own good, asking questions about where Mom worked, why she never talked about her past, why she had scars and calluses and a certain way of moving through the world like she'd learned to walk in places most people never went. Tomorrow was going to change everything. She just didn't know it yet. Within the hour, Dr. Pierce's fingers moved across his keyboard with surgical precision, each keystroke a calculated strike. The fluorescent lights overhead cast his face in clinical white as he typed the formal complaint to the North Carolina Medical Board. Practicing medicine without a license. Scope of practice violation, subsection 4.7.2. He'd been collecting ammunition for weeks, performance reviews dated backwards, incident reports fabricated with the care of a man constructing a case he'd built long before Ashley Cooper ever touched a scalpel. 80 staff members would hear about this. The entire hospital would know by end of business. He attached the stockpile documents, each one a small nail in a coffin he'd prepared months ago, and hit send. The screen glowed with the confirmation message delivered at 14:44. By 15:32, Security Chief Roland Washington stood outside the supply closet where Ashley was restocking for tubing, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. That was how she knew it was finished. Roland had worked with her for 3 years. He knew her. But institutional power moves faster than personal loyalty, and his badge carried orders that superseded everything else. Her access card was deactivated at the server level before he even walked her to her locker. The badge hung from her neck like a dead thing. "I'm sorry," Roland said, and she could hear the tremor in his voice, not fear, but the physical manifestation of a man caught between what he knew and what he was forced to do. She nodded once. She didn't apologize back. She didn't ask questions. She simply opened her locker, removed her personal items, a water bottle, a photograph of Marcus at 14 in his wrestling tournament stance, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the thread still holding after 20 years, and closed the door. Roland watched her leave with his arms crossed, not from aggression but from discomfort, a physical barrier he needed between himself and what was happening. When she was 3 steps down the corridor, he called out, "Captain," and then stopped himself, because using her rank was insubordination now. She kept walking. The parking lot was beginning to fill with the evening shift arriving, and she moved through them like water, unremarkable, forgotten, just another person leaving a job. The rain started as she reached her car, not the kind that fell but the kind that surrounded you, warm and relentless, and she sat in the driver's seat for 7 minutes without turning the key. The next morning, Dr. Pierce convened a mandatory staff meeting. 80 people crowded into the hospital's main conference room, and the air pressure changed when he entered, not from his presence but from the collective knowledge of what was about to happen. He stood at the podium with the posture of a man who'd won, chest forward, jaw relaxed, the expression of someone about to deliver a sermon he'd rehearsed in private. Effective immediately, he said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, we are implementing enhanced quality control measures and oversight protocols for all clinical decision-making. Yesterday's incident in room 304 represents a catastrophic breach of scope of practice guidelines. There will be consequences for violations. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew who he meant. The video had already been uploaded. A resident named Jennifer Chen, the one who'd seen the whole thing from the hallway, had filmed Pierce's tirade by the vending machines 3 days earlier, his face purple, his voice cutting like a scalpel, the words incompetent and liability echoing off stainless steel. She'd posted it that evening with a single caption, "This doctor called a Silver Star recipient incompetent." By morning, the video had 8,400 views. By afternoon, 50,000. By evening, it had been tagged to Duke Medical School, where a surgeon named Dr. Elizabeth Chen, no relation to Jennifer, but connected by the invisible networks that bind the medical profession, saw it while scrolling before sleep. That's when everything changed. Marcus Cooper pushed through the hospital's main entrance at 7:18 the next morning carrying a shadow box with the reverence of someone bearing relics. Inside, separated by velvet dividers, lay his mother's silver star, the pale blue ribbon and the eagle still radiant after 2 decades, her bronze star with the velar device, and the purple hearts, 2 of them, purple and gold like a prayer. He was 16 and 6 feet tall and moved through the lobby with the unconscious authority of someone who knew exactly where he needed to be. His voice when he called out carried the projection of a young man raised around soldiers. "Mom, they need to see these. They need to know." The volume wasn't shouting. It was clarity. It was command. Heads turned. People stopped walking. By the time he reached the reception desk, a gathered crowd had formed, not aggressively, but with the magnetic pull of something significant happening in ordinary space. James Garrett's hand trembled as he picked up his notepad from the bedside table. He hadn't spoken in 4 years, but his fingers could still write with the precision of muscle memory, and he scrawled the letters with the intensity of a man speaking for the first time. Reaper 6. His eyes flooded as he pressed the notepad to his chest. She was alive. She was here. And she'd saved him. A nurse passing his room stopped when she saw his face, the shake in his shoulders, and called for the charge nurse. By then, the entire 3rd floor knew that something significant was happening in the lobby. A Marine Corps colonel, visiting his nephew in orthopedics, heard the commotion and walked toward it with the natural authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. He saw the shadow box. He saw Marcus's face. And something in him recognized the weight of that moment. He stepped forward, and in a voice that had issued orders on 3 continents, he read the inscription aloud. Captain Ashley Cooper displayed extraordinary heroism under fire while sustaining combat operations in Tikrit. Under circumstances of extreme danger, Captain Cooper provided life-saving medical intervention to 14 personnel, operating independently and without support for 47 minutes while exposed to direct fire. Silver Star. Each word landed like a salute. The hallway fell silent. Not empty silence, but the kind of silence that holds weight, that becomes almost physical. A 2-star general, on the premises for a routine inspection tour, emerged from a conference room down the corridor. He saw the Marine colonel standing at attention in the middle of the hallway. He saw the shadow box. He saw the medals. And without hesitation, without needing explanation, he rendered a full salute, fist to his chest, the gesture that means everything in military culture. You are recognized. You are honored. You are one of us. The general held the salute for 3 seconds, then lowered his hand. No words were necessary. What happened next didn't require understanding. It required witnessing. A Pentagon liaison, called from an office 300 miles away by a general making phone calls, arrived at St. Michael's by 11:11 that morning wearing an ID badge that meant secure clearance and institutional weight. He met with hospital administration in a conference room with the door closed, and when he emerged, His voice was measured and precise. Reaper 6 saved 14 lives during operations that officially never happened. Those operations remain classified. The captain's record remains sealed. But her valor remains fact. He paused. The Pentagon is aware of what occurred here. We are grateful for her continued service to our veterans. By lunchtime, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the renowned surgeon from Duke Medical School who'd mentored Dr. Pierce 23 years earlier, had published an open letter to the North Carolina Medical Board. The letter was clinical and devastating. I taught Marcus Pierce the technical aspects of surgery. I did not teach him humanity. His actions disgrace our profession, endanger our patients, and represent the antithesis of everything medicine stands for. I formally disavow my recommendation for his credentialing and request immediate investigation into his clinical judgment and billing practices. The letter circulated through medical email servers like a virus. Within 3 hours, the North Carolina Medical Board had opened a formal review. Within 6, hospital administration had tasked their compliance officer with auditing every procedure Pierce had billed for in the past 18 months. They found $340,000 in fraudulent charges. Procedures performed on vulnerable veterans who couldn't advocate for themselves. Kickback payments from a medical supply company routed through shell corporations. Insurance claims fabricated with the precision of someone who understood the system well enough to exploit it. The hospital's general counsel called the FBI at 16:23 that afternoon. The Bureau's white-collar crimes unit was in the building by the next morning. Dr. Pierce's medical license was suspended by Friday. His badge was deactivated by the same security guard who'd escorted Ashley out. By Monday, federal prosecutors had offered him a choice: testify against the supply company executives and serve 18 months in minimum security, or face trial and 7 years. He took the deal. His attorney's face was the color of old bleach as she read the probation terms aloud in an office that smelled like desperation and air freshener: no medical practice, community service requirements, mandatory restitution, supervised release. 6 months later, Ashley Cooper walked through the entrance of the Raleigh VA Hospital wearing the crisp uniform of Director of Emergency Medicine. Her Silver Star ribbon was visible above her name tag, right where everyone who entered her office would see it. Staff members nodded as she passed, not the nervous acknowledgement of hierarchy, but the genuine respect of people who knew exactly what they were looking at. She carried herself with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst, from understanding that true power isn't a title on a placard but the willingness to act when action is required. James Garrett, voice restored through reconstructive surgery that had taken 3 months and a surgical team from Johns Hopkins, stood in the hallway and spoke his first words to her in 4 years: "Welcome back, Captain. We've been waiting." His voice was rough, rebuilt, but unmistakably his. She stopped and turned, and for a moment, just a moment, something that might have been emotion crossed her face. Then it was gone, replaced by the composure of someone back where she belonged. Across town, in a fluorescent-lit classroom at Raleigh Community College, Dr. Marcus Pierce demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic CPR dummy. He made $15 an hour. His hands that had once held the power to end careers with a signature, to destroy reputations with a word, now pressed rhythmically on unfeeling plastic while 19 disinterested students earned their recertification credits. A teenager in the back row was scrolling through her phone. A video was still circulating, attached to articles about healthcare fraud and the veterans he'd exploited. His name was now a cautionary tale spoken in medical ethics classes as an example of what not to become. Back at the VA hospital, Ashley conducted grand rounds with the same residents Pierce had once taught. She paused by the crash cart and looked at each of them directly. "Medicine," she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience and command, "is not about power or hierarchy. It's about the willingness to act when action is required, regardless of cost. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." She opened the crash cart drawer where the scalpels lay in their sterile packages, and no one in that room could miss the weight of what she'd done there, what she'd risked, what she'd sacrificed. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone in authority, or if you've ever stood by and watched someone else get dismissed, please subscribe and comment below. Tell us, what would you have done in Ashley's position? And if you know someone who deserves to have their story told, share this video. Because the quietest people in the room might just be the ones holding everything together.